Good afternoon. Welcome to day 3 of our plenary sessions this week. Today is a day to focus on fraud. We are going to have at the end of the session, just a heads up, we're just going to give you a little bit of an update following our discussion yesterday on the PI project. There were some elements of coordination with IAASB. So we've done that since. So before we leave today, you'll get an update from Josephine and Billy on that topic. Today, Josephine, you lose the mic right now. Lynn, I'll take charge and introduce the topic and walk through the fraud task force's initial views and recommendations at select topics. As always, it's really important for the board to give the task force clear direction and input on these topics. So please, I encourage you to speak up. We have a couple of topics. One related to how we're building off some of the concepts at 315, and that was one of the project objectives. And then the other major topic in this session is around enhanced communications, particularly focusing on communications with those charged with governance. We also will have a little bit of discussion on the proposed draft non-authoritative guidance, illustrating the relationship and linkage of ISA 240 and other ISAs. So that, as you remember, was as part of the project proposal. So I congratulate the task force for making progress on that topic too. So the goal, as you remember, is to issue that non-authoritative guidance in the first half of 2022. So Lynn, good morning to you. I hope you have a coffee or tea in hand, and we look forward to listening to you and having a fruitful discussion today.
Hello, everybody. It's good to be here back with our fraud topic. Now that we have the project proposal approved, excellent, from December, we're now moving on to discussing some of the key issues in that project proposal. And as Tom said, we've got 4 topics today. First of all, we've got the identification and assessment of risk of material misstatement due to fraud. Then we've got communication with those charged with governance, then transparency in reporting of fraud, and finally, non-authoritative guidance on the linkage between 240 and other ISAs. Before we start those discussions, there's some thanks I'd like to make. Firstly, to the task force and the staff, namely Diane, Julie, Lynn, Josephine, Sally Ann, Bev, Jasper and Hankin. Appreciate the way you have all carefully considered these topics and put together these papers. Thanks also to the board members who have provided us with input before the meeting. And we look forward to the comments and thinking and ideas by all board members during this session. They will inform where we go from here. Michelle, can we have the next slide, please? We have received some useful input from CAG and the SMP Advisory Group. So I'll just quickly run through that. The task force has not had time to consider it. So I will just give you the input that's been provided to us. Firstly, on transparency in reporting, we had a good discussion with CAG on the 4 options, and people had various views on those 4 options. Jim kindly brought it to a conclusion at the end and agreed and suggested that the 4 alternatives did make a satisfactory basis for consultation with users of audit reports and that all four had merit of some kind and should be consulted further. There was also discussion about the fact that the four alternatives may not be mutually exclusive, and there may be some mix and matching that would work. Another point made was that it would be important to give the users of financial statements some real examples of what this would look like, and we said that we intended to use some of the examples that are in the supplement to do that. And finally, on this dot point, we were cautioned not to be boilerplate in terms of the reporting. Secondly, the members suggested that we had to be careful about scalability for less complex organisations, and particularly the length of the auditor's report in that regard. There were a number of comments about the importance of all of the players in the ecosystem playing their part in terms of this, so that whatever is in the audit report is mirrored in the financial statements. On ROMs, the caution provided to us was to not repeat 315, which we don't intend to do, and to look at what was happening around the world, and specifically looking at Japan, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and the United States. So that was useful input. Finally, there are a couple of clarifications. One person suggested that maybe we should use ESG reporting as a part of this project. We told them that that was not in the scope of the proposal. And finally, there was a question about whether the work we were doing was still focused on the risk of material misstatement, or whether it was tied to some other threshold. And we assured people that it was still the risk of material misstatement due to fraud in the financial statements. Finally, there was the PIB observer suggested that the changes proposed in terms of risk identification and assessment, communication and transparency were important, and highlighted the importance of the expectation gap. So they were the major things we heard on from CAG, but I'm sure Jim will elaborate or conclude in some way. So, Jim?
Thank you, Lynn. And I agree with the points that you highlighted there. There was a fair amount of discussion about transparency and how the fraud would be communicated, specifically not the CAG members did not want what I would describe as a boilerplate, which probably most of you are familiar with that issue we often deal with in reporting. So that was one point I would add. And then the other was also to be sure that the disclosures are reviewed as well for perhaps indicators of fraud or puffery or something along those lines. So, but we did have a very good discussion about the fraud, and there was support from the CAG to move forward with a proposal. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jim. It was a good discussion. So moving on to the SMP Advisory Group. There was broad agreement with the approach that we are taking, but some words of caution. Firstly, they noted that, and I'm quoting here, that there is no real change in audit approach that would reliably ensure enhanced risk, fraud identification and deterrent. Thus, expectations may be raised that an auditor cannot fulfill in all cases. So I think that is sage advice, and something as a task force and as a board, we're going to have to ongoingly ask ourselves and make sure that we are not making changes for the sake of it. There was a suggestion in terms of scalability that our proposal to put the why and how an application material shouldn't be in the standard, but should be in training and educational material. And also to remember that those charged with governance and SMEs are often the same as management. And penultimately, that they saw a danger in requiring an auditor to publicly report suspicions of potential fraud beyond the entity's disclosures. And they supported the 4 options going to users of financial statements for consideration. So that's the input we've received from CAG and SMP Advisory Group. We don't have reactions and numbers like Josephine's had on the last 2 days, but they will be, one, carried forward to this discussion, but secondly, taken into account by the task force. Next slide, please. I just want to talk about the relationship between 240 and other ISAs. 240 expands on how 315 and 330 are to be applied for risks of material misstatement due to fraud. I am told, and I got this wrong at CAG, that ISA is not a special consideration standard like 600. 240 applies always, and 600 only when you are in scope. For example, you are in a group situation. So 240 expands, it doesn't repeat other standards. So this project will expand and build on the requirements in other ISAs where applicable, providing a fraud lens. And we will reference fraud lens throughout this project and hope that this short introduction to the concept helps provide you with some context of what we mean by fraud lens. Moving right on, next slide, please. One of the most significant parts of this project is the identifying and assessing the risks of material misstatement due to fraud. In the project proposal, we included a proposed action to enhance and clarify requirements and application material in 240 to incorporate the recent changes to 315. 315 is the foundational procedures for identifying, I'm going to use ROMs from now on, ROMs. And 240 translates how those procedures can be applied with a fraud lens. However, it was noted when we were looking at this that 240 doesn't follow the same structure as 315 revised. And in some cases, there was insufficient explanation in 240 as to how to apply the fraud lens. So that's why we intend that application material will be developed to elaborate on the why and how. For example, 240 may include application material to explain why the understanding of the application of the financial reporting framework is important with regard to where and how fraud can occur, and to explain how to take the inherent risk factors into account for the auditor's consideration of fraud. We believe that in some cases, the required procedures in 240 may not drive the behavioural changes that is needed to perform robust procedures to identify and assess ROMs due to fraud. For example, the engagement team discussion in extent 240 doesn't require specific topics to be discussed, such as the exchange of ideas among team members about risk factors. And as noted on the last slide, we will not be repeating 215. We will expand and provide examples. So that brings me to the two proposed changes, which are on the right-hand side of the slide. The first one is to change the structure. So we have a similar structure to 315, and we have that structure in the issues paper. And secondly, we have proposed changes to demonstrate the nature of the interaction between 240 and 315. The goal of, and just a note before we move on to the questions, today is not to re-deliberate 315. Today is around what do we have to put into 240 to improve its usability for practitioners. Next slide, please. So that brings us to our first set of questions, which, Tom, I suggest we take as a package for comment. The first one relates to the structure of 240. The second one in terms of the proposed changes, including whether we should continue to maintain Appendix 1, which has all the key risk factors set out. And thirdly, is there anything else we should be considering in terms of 315? So with that, Tom, I'll pause and hand it back to you for questions, for comments. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll solicit comments now. I have a favor to ask people. When you speak, please speak closely into the microphone. We hear some parts of the room, it has a hard time picking up, and they don't have speakers right in front of the desk. So I'm asking people just to speak closely into the microphone. Okay, Fernando.
Thank you, Tom, and hello, everyone. I do support the proposed changes in terms of the structure, especially after seeing the benefits we saw with 315 and the good feedback from practice and other users on how it was changed. I think that also will bring a good benefit to the fraud standard. I think it's too early really to understand in more detail potential changes to requirements and application materials in terms of what, why, and how. But I do see the benefit of bringing those concepts into the way it's going to be written. Probably I will be more interested going forward in the work effort, what's going to be different, what we will need to do compared to what we actually do in practice today, how documentation will change. But definitely having the change in the structure is a good start to align at least both the standards and help practitioners with a better understanding of what they need to do and why they needed to do it. Thanks.
Thank you, Fernando. Kai Morton.
Thank you, and thank you, Lynn, and the task force for the work done. I agree with Fernando's point that aligning the content to the structure of 315 is helpful. But when I look at the issues paper, and I wonder if we should not rather put that content in 315 than keeping it so that the risk assessment piece would be in 315. 315 deals with both fraud and error. And you repeated multiple times, Lynn, saying that we should not repeat the requirements in 315. But I think how we end up doing this in practice, I think it is something that should be dealt with somewhat in the same way. So it's done when you do your risk assessment. So it's more placement of the requirements and the application material. And currently, there's probably not that many new requirements to be added in, but it's more of application material and the way of how you would approach this when you do your 315 work. So as I said, generally I agree with structuring the content, but I think the placement would better be for the risk assessment or an identification and risk assessment to be in 315 rather than in 240. So 240 would pick up after the point that you've done that. Thank you.
Thank you, Kai. Isabel.
Yes, hello everybody, and thanks to Lynn and the task force. I agree with the restructuring of the standard to conform with 315, with the warning, but Lynn, you mentioned it, is that we should not repeat what is in 315. We have to be very cautious about that and keep in mind the principle of the draft cusp. And try to avoid this duplication that create a bigger standard and that make the perception that they are more complex than what they are. I also had a comment on the proposed paragraph, the proposed relocation of paragraph 24 that currently is as a title of over-information. And some in the room would remember that at the time we revised 720, we noted that this labeling of over-information in 240 had nothing to do with what we call over-information in 720. So therefore, I agree with the proposal you're making to relabel this over-information as information from other sources, because we solve an inconsistency within the IAASB. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. So.
Thank you. Thanks, Lynn, and thank you to the team. I think probably similar to others, I was a little bit nervous about the repetition from 315, and so what you've explained is really helpful there, that isn't the intention. Broadly, I think addressing the structure is a good thing. It will be helpful, make it more understandable. I think there's maybe just also managing expectations that structure won't necessarily impact overall auditor behaviour, but it at least makes it more aligned. With 315 being a new standard, obviously there's going to be implementation issues coming through during the lifetime of this project, so it will be good to be alive to how those are developing. In terms of the changes in some of the outreach, also had feedback around scalability, particularly in relation to the internal control components for SMEs in particular, and consideration around reporting. I thought the material on financial reporting framework was really useful, and obviously that is a big thing. You asked about additional areas, and I think one that occurred was perhaps something along the lines of the impact of a new financial reporting standard, particularly one where it impacts the reported earnings or the disclosures or something like that. That may trigger a particular risk for manipulation of the financial statements. And then finally, I wondered whether it was possible to consider, as we go through here, something around the responsibilities of preparers, and how that interfaces with the auditor's responsibilities, particularly consideration, for example, of how management has identified and addressed the fraud risk, to perhaps, I suppose, inform the auditor's considerations. Not drive them, but as part of the process, because clearly they have the primary responsibility. Thanks.
Thank you, Kyra.
Tom, thanks. Good evening. And Lynn, thank you very much for the presentation and all the work you have done, and the members of the task force, and of course the staff. This fraud project is a very important one. As we all know, it's one of the most important strategic projects which we now have within the IAASB. My comments are as follows. First, to the first question which you have raised, I generally agree with restructuring of ISA 240 to follow that in ISA 315. My comment to the question 2a is, I also generally agree with the proposed changes to enhance and strengthen the procedures for identifying and assessing the risk of material misstatement due to fraud. However, it does not make sense, in my view, to apply the requirements of either 315 on assessing the risk of material misstatement due to fraud if these are always construed to be significant risk. In my view, such risks are not always significant risk. In many cases, as I have heard, fraud of a small scale may be perpetrated by employees or customers and may be regarded as a cost of doing business, particularly when the cost of the controls needed to prevent or detect such fraud approach the cost of the fraud. For this reason, I believe that there needs to be a fundamental rethink about when risk of material misstatements due to fraud should be significant risk. I'm also not convinced that evaluating the adequacy of all internal control components, such as control environment, risk assessment, and monitoring with respect to fraud, is useful for smaller entities. The result of such an evaluation would be that most small entities would be regarded as having deficient internal control components, even though these components have no direct impact on the risk material misstatement due to fraud at the assertion level. My comment to little b is, I agree with maintaining Appendix 1 on the fraud risk factors. Consideration can be given as to whether this list can be augmented, modernized, and streamlined. In particular, consideration should be given to setting these inherent risk factors at a higher level, much like the 5 inherent risk factors for classes of transactions, account balances, and disclosures. There are currently almost 70 fraud risk factors, which is far too granular. Furthermore, some risk factors deal with matters that are not observable, such as the intention of management. Fraud risk factors should be limited to matters that are observable to the auditor, rather than the auditor needing to impute matters such as management intent. And my last comment to question 3 is, I have no other changes from ISA 315 revised to 2019 that I would address. Thanks very much. Back to you, Tom.
Thank you, Kai. Chun-Wei?
Thank you, Tom. Very good morning to all colleagues from Singapore. Thank you, Lynn and team, for, again, a very enjoyable read. Thank you for your explanation before this conversation. I think it's all really helpful and clear. Just making some broader comments first in relation to this section. I think the approach proposed by the Fraud Task Force is sensible, well thought through, and very easy to support generally. Early on in the paper, I think it's in paragraph 10, that talks about some of the issues in the X10 to 40. One of the observations was around how the required procedures in some cases are perfunctory and does not drive the desired behavior. And I assume what we meant was that the procedures have been written in such a way that makes them susceptible to being applied in a perfunctory manner. And I think this is a really good reminder to us as we progress this project and as we think about the different changes that we're going to make. I think 240, to my mind, is not a bad standard. It's carefully designed. The intent behind each of the requirements may not be very clearly and perfectly articulated, but they are well thought through nonetheless. So as we think about what to revise here, I think we need to critically challenge every single piece of changes that we want to propose. Will that move the dial? In practice, will we end up over-engineering, overburdening the standards such that we end up breaking the dial instead, and maybe instead of solving that perfunctory issue, we end up making this an even bigger perfunctory exercise, amplifying the problem that we're trying to solve. So this, I guess, a caution, and I'm sure this what the task force and the board will bear in mind as we move forward with this. I want to just maybe respond to the questions here. Number one, I agree with restructuring. Number two, I have some more specific points to make. Paragraph 19, where we talk about the sources of other information. I'm not convinced yet that the fraud lens should be more prominently used for some procedures versus others, and to sort of have that in the requirement. I think we risk de-emphasizing the importance of keeping this heightened fraud mindset in other procedures, and turning this principle-based requirement into something that is quite specific, and it may just turn into a check-the-box exercise. I think maybe what we can consider doing is expanding the application material with further illustrations. That might be more helpful. I want to call out B on 720. I do think this is really helpful called out, and it's important. Many sees the requirement under 720 to be just about ensuring consistency between the financial statements and other information. So it's just an additional step to be done. It incurs a lot of chargeable hours, but it's underappreciated by management and by the users of audit report. But I agree with the task force. This exercise could actually be helpful in flagging, for example, aggressive corporate reporting behavior and motivation by management to portray the company performance in certain light. So I want to just underscore this and support this point. 20A, within the parentheses, there are some examples of what has been referred to as emerging external indicators. I would be quite alarmed if this category of external indicators are ignored. We talk about short selling reports, negative media attention, negative analyst reports. So I think these are really blatant emerging external indicators, which I'm pretty sure, and I hope auditors today are looking at already. So I'm just wondering, are there maybe less blatant indicators that we should be flagging as well, or instead? Just two quick other points. The paragraph 33, I think this may be quite consistent with Kai Wei's point here. The approach described makes sense to me, talking about the components, but just a word of caution again, we are all aware that this is one of the key areas within 315 that practitioners are most concerned with from a scalability perspective. So while I agree 240 will benefit from an internal control emphasis, I'm not entirely sure if a full-blown component by component approach from a fraud perspective is needed to move the dial. So that's my response to A. To B, again, I agree with what Kai would have said. It's very well articulated. I won't repeat what I said. 3, I don't have anything else to add on. That's all from me. Thanks, Tom and Lynn.
Okay, Lynn, just let me know, you have about 7 more people who want to come in, but if at a juncture you'd like to come in, just let me know.
I'm happy just to run through all of the comments, Tom, and I'll comment at the end.
Okay, Edo.
Yes, thank you, Tom, and Lynn and the task force. Many thanks for the paper. It clearly solicited my thinking, and I was, as I was reading this, the suggestions and the steps, for example, in respect to question 1, that all seems to make sense, and noting, of course, because I had similar reflection as others, that we should not repeat 315 and that it should really expand on the requirements of 315 and specific to fraud. But I was also wondering whether this is moving the dial. And this made me think of one of the other projects I'm involved with, Going Concern. And in Going Concern, we have, and we've talked about the ecosystem needs to come up with a solution. It's not, so to what extent can we bring the ecosystem in? And in the Going Concern standard, we ask for management's assessment. And on a topic that is societally relevant, I do not think that it would be inappropriate for auditors to ask management for their fraud risk assessment, such that they articulate what the fraud risk, what their belief is of what fraud, where fraud could perpetrate, etc. And that we, as auditors, evaluate that fraud risk assessment. And clearly, we would still need to have the understanding of the internal control environment and do our risk assessment on our own. But the starting point is also putting the onus on the entity. And I think if we bring that in, it may allow for more targeted revisions to this standard to draw that out. And it will also be a basis for the discussion with those charged with governance and the directors of the company, whether they're together or not, or whether it's one and the same or not, to have a more purposeful discussion. So that's my, so rather than going into all the details, I've provided you further comments offline. But this was one where I thought, well, maybe we need to think a little bit more out of the box and see how we can involve the company in this, where I don't think that it's inappropriate to ask. There is plenty of guidance out there. Well, the COSO has great documentation to support entities to do this as a key element in part of our risk assessment, as well as our discussions with management throughout. So that's a little bit as an overarching comment, and I may come back to this when we talk about the relationship with those charged with governance. Maybe in connection with 2B, I would be in favor of an appendix 1. Well, it's easier for practitioners to take that out and to bring under their arm with them. I don't think it is too long. Maybe in contrast to some others, I think it could even benefit from some further factors to consider. Thank you.
Thank you. Josh?
Thank you, Chair Tom, and good early morning, everybody. I have first my sincere appreciation to Lynn and the task force members for their hard work in preparing this issues paper. And I have just one comment about the three-bit relationship of the 315. I support revising 240 with a flow similar to 315, but I would like to create some sort of flowchart to show the relationship or differences between 315 and 240 at the appendix 2 or summary. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you. Wendy?
Thank you, Tom, and thank you to the task force. Thank you, Lynn. It was a great paper and have some of the same thoughts that you've heard from others, so I will not pile on, just keep to the most important ones and send you separately offline some recommendations. This is a difficult standard. Auditors have struggled with it. That's why we are here today. So what I struggled with was some of the recommendations. How would it change behavior? So I agree with the restructure to align with 315. I don't want to put too much in 315 or in 240 from 215. So I'm looking for some good balance and making it very clear in 240 that the steps are incremental for the evaluation of fraud. So then going back and kind of similar to what Ito was talking about, so what would change behavior? Some of the incremental questions and activities that we're thinking about, the brainstorming, thinking about how management could perpetrate fraud, things like that. I think we should add in discussions about related parties, inquiries about related parties, discussions with other people beyond who we normally talk to in the fraud inquiries, beyond those charged with governance, beyond typically in management, but people maybe in operations or in internal audit or management specialists, things that are different, clearly different than we've done before. So in summary, incremental, different requirements than what we had that would change behavior. I also support some sort of assertion from management of how they assess fraud. And we already encourage asking questions that way, so you get those type of answers in terms of where you think the risks are when you're having those discussions to determine the level of fraud risk and where you have to focus your audit. On 2B, fine to have it in the agenda. Sorry, fine to have it in the appendix. Wondering if the appendix might need to be modernized a little bit, but it's fine not to import it into the standard, because I do worry putting too much into 240 will make it confusing. Too much duplication does not get auditors to have better behavior. And I think I've covered the answers to all three questions. Thank you, Lynn. And thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Wendy. Eric?
Thanks, Tom and Lynn and the team. I found the paper very, very well laid out and very easy to follow. I, like others, am supportive of pursuing the restructuring of 240. Like others, not sure yet exactly where the material will end up geographically in each case, but I think at least that would be a good starting point to lay things out of what we need and then consider the appropriate place for it. Similar to others, when we're discussing fraud and going concern in similar meetings, it sort of begs the question about whether our approaches should have an element of consistency. And I think kind of what Edo was bringing out there about management's assessment and so on, it kind of begs the question, well, shouldn't we be thinking about along the same lines in some of these standards as they get developed? So I thought that was, I was supportive of that kind of thinking. On question 2, I was supportive of the direction being taken there and retaining Appendix 1 and possibly enhancing it where needed. I had some thoughts when the paper started talking about other sources of information and looking in other places for fraud risks and so forth. I think as long as we're doing that in the context of looking for risks of material misstatement, that, you know, as long as we're using it from that lens, as opposed to just kind of any kind of fraud that might be going on and whether other documents could have implications for fraud, I think we need to be careful about not putting the auditor's responsibilities beyond where they are today. And on question 3, I had just one suggestion for you to think about, was whether in paragraph 35 of 315, which is the stand back evaluation about whether you've got all the audit evidence you need from the risk assessment process, I wonder if we need to look at that as well from the point of view of that evaluation from a fraud risk perspective as well. That's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Warren?
Good evening, everyone, and thanks, Lynn and team for sharing the fraud paper. I also enjoyed reading it and thought that it was very well laid out. Many of my views are consistent with those already expressed, so I won't repeat points. But yes, with regards to number 1, also support the idea of aligning the structure of ISA 240 with ISA 315, and also had the view that it could be useful to think about relocating some of the content in ISA 240 into ISA 315 as a possible way of avoiding potential repetition. For brevity, to deal with 2A and 3 concurrently, specifically with respects to the point about scalability, whether it might be helpful to identify certain aspects of ISA 240 which are sort of mandatory, and then those aspects of ISA 240 which can be scaled depending on the auditor's judgment and the analysis of the risk of misstatement specifically due to fraud. That could be one way of sort of dealing with the scalability issue while clarifying what the auditor is required to do. And whether or not it might be helpful to have a rebuttable presumption about whether or not fraud is actually a significant risk, tying in to one of the earlier comments. So, for example, specifically in an entity that has a relatively simple business model, perhaps we don't need to have fraud identified there as a significant risk. There was a very interesting comment in paragraphs 22, I think it was, or thereabout, where you talked about how specialists are involved in the engagement team's discussion about fraud and the risk of misstatement. I just wondered if there would be scope to also consider the use of specialists both in the risk assessment process and in the actual testing that might be carried out, in addition to just the discussions that are taking place among members of the engagement team. And I suppose related closely to that, perhaps as part of this whole concept of, you know, being unpredictable, being innovative when dealing with the risk of fraud, moving the scale, to borrow one of the earlier terms, whether it might be helpful to piggyback off of some of the work being done on the ISA 500 project, where they're talking extensively about external sources of information and the use of technology. Maybe there's an opportunity to think about how that could be contextualized in the case with fraud and risks relating to fraud. I also agree with having a look at management commentary and management's assessment, rather, not management commentary, but management's assessments of the risk of misstatement due to fraud. I like that idea. It would dovetail very nicely, not only with COSO framework, but with a lot of codes on corporate governance in different jurisdictions, where there is usually some sort of requirement imposed on management or those charged with governance to safeguard the organization's resources. So there could be something there that may be worth exploring, and would also sort of amplify that whole sense of the auditor gaining an understanding of the sort of control environment and the control culture, which is already laid out quite neatly in ISA 315. So those are some of our general observations with respects to 2A, and then with respects also to number 3. And then specifically with regards to 2B, I also agree that retaining Appendix 1 would be useful, and would also iterate that, yes, it is a very useful resource for those of us who, for our sins, are also involved in teaching auditing to students. The specifics in the appendix, I think it's currently structured to deal with fraudulent financial reporting and then fraud involving misappropriation of assets, which is fine. But maybe if you're going through the exercise of sort of structuring ISA 240 to resemble ISA 315, maybe the appendix could also be organized in a similar way to freshen it up as part of the process also of introducing new examples and illustrations. And then just a request, please to make sure that if there's something that's in the appendix, it has some sort of reference either in the main standard or in the application guidance, and vice versa. But really those are the only major points from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Warren. Bill?
Thank you, Lynn, the task force and staff. Look, my comments are consistent very much with those that have gone before me. Very supportive of the restructure to align with 315, but would be asking that it be incremental. Similarly, I'd also, and I'll make this comment many times, caution on making it scalable. I think I'm very, very supportive of the engagement team discussion and the comments that have been made earlier about communication with those charged with governance and management, although again, there has to be a caution there about the ability to get the responses and not to put a responsibility on the auditor that they cannot fulfill. As for the fraud risk factors in the appendix, I'm supportive of that being maintained. And I do have some later comments about the audit report, but I'll hold those off until later. So supportive of the comments that have gone before me with those few extra comments.
Thank you, Bill. Last but not least, Sachika.
Thank you, Tom, and hello, everybody. On question 1, I support restructuring. I think it's very useful. And on question 2 on appendix 1, I'm not sure whether it's too long or short, but I totally agree that we need some modernization. And other suggestion I have is that maybe it's a little bit kind of in the same direction with what Edo and perhaps Sue said before, but I think the provision that stipulate auditor's responsibility based on the roles of other financial reporting ecosystems, such as management and those charged with governance, will be more effective than the provision that only address the auditor's responsibility, because I think collaborative effort with other participants in the financial reporting ecosystem is very powerful to address the issue of fraud. So maybe when the task force will consider actual requirement and application materials around this area, it will be helpful to consider. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've done pretty much anyone who's not on the task force input in here. So got a lot of feedback, a lot of consistent themes, Lynn, about, I think, some general support for the flow of 315, but some questions about can many of the topics be within 315, and then a number of helpful suggestions throughout about Appendix 1 and other matters.
Thank you all very much for that. I've tried to structure my comments now into 6 categories. First one is on structure, agree. Thank you for that feedback. It was unanimous that we should restructure it, which is valuable. But there were also some good cautions for us. Don't repeat, critically challenge, and don't overload 240. All things that I think are absolutely valid and really important. There was also comment to make sure we keep in line with other projects, and I think that's actually quite useful in terms of thinking and restructuring, that we do look there. And a comment was made, we could just combine 240 into 315. We've heard that comment before, but we have decided on a route that takes us down a separate standard, so we won't be pursuing that any further. In terms of Appendix 1, good to get it reinforced that we should keep that appendix. A variety of comments though, in terms of some wanted it streamlined, some wanted more added, some wanted it modernised, and we had comments about restructure. So we'll look at all of those, and I suspect that we will probably use all of those techniques when we have another look at Appendix 1 and link it into the standard. In terms of the changes, some really useful input in that regard, and thank you very much for those. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm just going to pick a few. Significant risk isn't something that's in the project plan. I suspect though it might come up, so it's off the table at present, but I hear you, Kaiui. I think the comment that some of current 240 is perfunctory and we're trying to build it out was a wise comment, and certainly something that will guide us. Yes, on paragraph 24, the inconsistency is something that we were trying to solve in terms of other information. In fact, there were quite a few comments about sources of information and external information, and they will be taken into account. And a couple of other specifics in terms of detail. There is a stand back in 315, and we'll need to look at whether we need to, with a forward lens, add anything to it, but it's already there as a part of 315. And in terms of specialists, we will be bringing forward in future meetings the use of forensic specialists, because that is one of the issues identified in the project proposal. Moving on to my 4th area of scalability, good reminders there in terms of scalability. In particular, heard the importance of looking at it in terms of internal controls, and that maybe we'll need some separate sections on less complex entities. We'll have to see whether that works or doesn't work. Fifthly, in terms of the ecosystem, like the comments around management's assessment and doing what we can to bring the ecosystem into the standard without overburdening the standard, of course. Ideas were around responsibility of preparers, financial reporting standards, management's assessment. So certainly that is an area that we will think about seriously. And in fact, as we move on to those charged with governance, It's one of the key themes we talk about there. And I wanted to finish on my sixth one of behaviour, because this whole standard is aimed at changing behaviour and putting more emphasis by people on fraud. So all of the changes that we are making, whilst they might be incremental in nature, will aim to change behaviour. And one of the lenses, as well as a fraud lens, we need to run over our changes are, does it make a difference to the behaviour of auditors in doing this work? So I think with that, Tom, I've at a high level covered all the comments, but they were extremely useful to us and very grateful for your insights. With that, Tom, can I move on? Or
Please do. I don't see any tense up.
okay, next comment, next slide, please. As I said, we've already started to talk about this as you've been raising your points, but the project proposal noted that the required communication with those charged with governance on fraud considerations may not be sufficiently robust in the current environment. And in addressing this key issue, we propose two sets of changes to 240. One is encouraging two-way communication through specific discussions with those charged with governance about fraud-related matters, and two, emphasising the ongoing nature of communication with those charged with governance throughout the audit. So specifically, the task force proposes that we require, so a new requirement, that the auditor has two-way communication with those charged with governance about specific fraud-related matters, including discussing the fraud risk factors present in the entity, possible areas that are susceptible to misstatement due to management bias, the auditor's evaluation of the entity's components of the system of internal control, and the auditor's assessment of ROMs due to fraud. In addition, the task force proposes 240 emphasise that the auditor should communicate with those charged with governance about matters relating to fraud at appropriate times throughout the audit, not just at one point in time. So in the discussion, just a couple of things to note. In 260, there is the framework for communicating with those charged with governance, and the proposal is to expand on that framework. And it's exactly the same with 315, which includes requirements for communication with governance, and 240 will expand on those requirements. So in some ways, these are very simple changes, but they're also incredibly important changes. And as a person who also does work in the governance area, I know I would welcome ongoing discussions in this area with my auditors. So with that, moving on to the questions slide, we're asking your views about those two proposals. We also, in the paper, in paragraphs 64 and 65, give two options, and we should really have added it to question 4, so I'm doing it now. And that is, we give one option that suggests a new requirement to supplement 240, covering the timing of communication, and in the application material, talking about the nature of that communication. Or option 2 is putting it into the application material only. So we have got 2 options there. Interested in preferences. The task force, as I've already said, is heading towards option 1, but in case there are different views, I'm happy to hear them. And then there is the second question of, is there anything we've missed? So with that, Tom, I will send back. If you had made comments on these items in the last section, we'll take that, we'll roll those forward, obviously. You don't need to repeat them, but very happy for any new input on this topic. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Lynn. Okay, anyone want to comment on the questions 4 and 5, which are on the screen, and any of the additional inputs that Lynn's seeking? Edo.
Thank you, Tom. Well, in reading this section, Lynn, this particularly triggered my thinking that I articulated before. And in reading this particular section, it is a lot what the auditor does in respect of the fraud risk factors, the risk assessment, etc. And I am of the firm belief that you have a more robust discussion if both parties come prepared to the table. And we, particularly in the smaller smaller clients, it often feels the way you've described it here, where often you're talking to them rather than having a discussion about it. And I think for this being an ecosystem issue, I would prefer a larger onus on management and those charged with governance. So I was struck by the comment in paragraph 55, where it says those charged with governance may not necessarily have the detailed knowledge to respond to specific fraud-related discussions. So the first question that came in my mind is, they're not doing their job. But that was sort of my thinking around this. And so maybe if I can summarize it, yes, I am in favor of increased requirements of two-way communication. Yes, throughout, and yes, a requirement. But I would turn the lens a little bit and have a management prepared assessment to be part of the mix. And let's see, yeah, that's all for me at the moment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sachiko?
Thank you, Tom. On question 4 about emphasizing the ongoing nature of communication with those charged with governance in paragraph 64 and 65 about options, I support option 1, proposing a new requirement rather than option 2, which is proposing new application material. Because I think it is critical for the auditor to communicate those charged with governance, a matter related to fraud at appropriate time throughout the audit. And I think it makes more sense to be a requirement rather than just emphasizing it in application material. But at the same time, maybe we also need to a little bit consider scalability issue when we're drafting requirement and application material. And on question 5, I don't have any other matter to comment. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you. Yosh?
Thank you, Tom. As for the direction of the task force, so I also because I also consider that the emphasis on continuous and ongoing two-way communication with the TCWG would be very effective for audit quality. So option 1 is desirable. It's same to such goal. However, in cases where facts and signs of fraud or new fraud risk are recognized, it may be necessary to more strengthen communication with the TCWG. So the step-up approach in level of communication or audit procedure should be included in this, and like application material. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you. Sue?
Thank you. I also support the direction here around enhancing two-way communication. Lynn, when you talked, the language you were using was very much sort of aligned about the two-way sharing. There were a few points in the papers where that didn't necessarily come through, and so I think it's something to just keep a real eye on as we go through, because that two-way piece, rather talking about sharing information rather than telling people, I think is really good. A couple of other points through the paper. The auditor evaluation of the system of internal control. We had a question as to whether that might be a bit early in the process, because it is iterative, and maybe sort of particularly when you're talking about LCEs, whether you might have actually got to the stage to be able to make that communication at that point. In paragraph 59, I wasn't sure whether that was potentially going to pick up the requirement there is in the UK about speaking to others or dealing with others to whom fraud is communicated. And I thought that was a good potential addition. In the design supervision and review application material, I had probably the same comment that Warren has made about including their thought about adding team members with particular skills to address the particular fraud risks. That could be a good add. In terms of your two options, I'm probably going to throw out a third one, which is that I agree with the option one in terms of requirement, but I wonder whether 260 is a better place for it than 240. And then finally, on your question 5, other things, we've got a discussion coming up with 500 around the information to be used as audit evidence, and particularly in relation to authenticity. But I do wonder whether 240 is a place to have some kind of considerations there around the risks that there may be to tampering with information or authenticity there. And then finally on your bullet 5, while we talk about lots of communications, there's always the risk in certain countries have rules around tipping off, and the need to be careful around maybe regulatory requirements or confidentiality, that there are points at which there needs to be alternative considerations as, that come into play, particularly in fraud and very sensitive areas. Thanks.
Thank you, Sue. Taioe?
Thanks, Tom. I have 2 comments. First, for question 4. In principle, I agree in seeking to enhance two-way communication with those charged with governance. However, the requirements should not be made too granular so that they adversely affect auditors' behavior by having auditors not identify fraud risks simply to avoid onerous communication requirements. This is another reason why not all fraud risk should automatically construed as significant risk. My comment to question 5 is, overall, I believe the approach in ISA 240 needs to change to match that in ISA 540 and the new draft of ISA 500. That is for the auditor to consider what management and those charged with governance have done to identify, assess, and react to fraud risk, and then to have auditors design and perform audit procedures to deal with the results of that consideration. That have been my comments. Tom, thanks.
Thank you, Kai. Kai Morton.
Thank you. And on the questions, I do agree that requirement is the right way forward. As we already have, as noted in the issues paper, we already have a requirement on communication with those charged with governance in 260. Following up on Ido's point, if there is more that could be done, challenge whether we could increase that. And as being discussed here as well, it's difficult to put a requirement in our standards that would force two-way communication, especially when you move down to smaller, less complex entities. And the challenge there on scalability, whether there is a way that we can make this more scalable. I think that's a general point on the standard as a whole. But this is I think is a pain point in LC audits where to get value out of those discussions in general. Thank you.
Thank you, Kai. Choi?
Thank you, Tom. So when we did our outreach in relation to this segment, I think the one most common comment is in relation to scalability, in relation to, for example, owner-managed entities where those structure of governance equals to management. And that the benefit of communication will not necessarily accrue in such audit. But really just looking at the extent to 40, it is already, the conditionality is already built in where it always refers to unless all of those charge of governance are involved, the auditors shall. So I think just to, I guess, continue looking at that from that lens and be very careful about building in scalability into whatever revision we want to put through here. Just a few more comments. I have the exact same reaction to paragraph 55 as Ado. When we look at large multinational entity and then, those charge of governance may not have the detailed knowledge, but, we're talking about fraud risk factors specific to the entities, business factors, and areas susceptible to misstatement due to management bias. So presumably this will be what those charge of governance collectively as a group will be able to speak knowledgeably to, regardless of size. So I'll be really concerned if they only have an overview of the management process. So I'll agree with Ado there. 56C, and more generally, I think there potentially quite a lot of interplay with the requirements in 540. And this is one example in 56C. I don't see a lot of reference to 540, but I presume the task force, as we progress with this part of the work, will continue to look into that, because I think that there will be a lot of interplay, and the requirements and the references in 540 will be quite relevant here. In terms of the two options, 64 and 65, maybe a little bit to Sue's point, I look at 260, the requirement, there is already a requirement relating to the timing. Auditors shall communicate on a timely basis. And I really question, putting a requirement there in terms of the option one to say that you need to communicate at appropriate times throughout the audit. Will that really change anything? So I think, like the task force, inclined towards more emphasis in this area. I'm not entirely sure just putting in it as one more requirement will move the dial. So looking at a more holistic package of solution, tying back to what is in 260 and re-articulating it in relation to this communication on fraud will be what I would support. Thanks.
Thank you. Bill?
Thanks, Tom. As to the two-way communication, very supportive of that. I've already made a comment about the caution about being able to manage the action by others. And perhaps it's a bigger issue that we deal with as well as putting it in a standard, whatever. And we'll talk a lot about getting members of the ecosystem to all work together here, and maybe there are other tactics we ought to engage to support that two-way communication. As for the timing of the communication, I think the principle stands that if it's a requirement in another standard, and in this case 260, it ought not be repeated. But it simply depends on whether the 260 requirement is strong enough. Thank you.
Thank you. Eric?
Thank you, Tom, and generally supportive of the direction of the task force here and strengthening the two-way communication. I also agree with option one. I didn't think option two was really an optimal solution. I just had some minor or some comments or observations that perhaps Lynn could help me with. One is in here we're talking in 54D about communication with those charged with governance about the auditor's assessment of the ROMs due to fraud. And we've already got a requirement in 260 to communicate the significant risks. So I just wasn't sure what the difference between those two requirements would be, what the change would really be there. Further down in 60, sorry, I'm just trying to find my notes here. In 61, it's mentioned about some new application material could be developed to emphasize that appropriate direction, supervision, and review is equally important when performing the communications required by 240 and in assigning the right people. That seemed to be a requirement that's already there, and I wasn't sure why we would need or what the application material might really say beyond what we already have on that. And in 72, I believe it is, there is a suggestion to add new application material to address circumstances when the independence of those charged with governance from management is adversely affected. Again, I would have thought that's a general requirement that's already been addressed elsewhere. So I'm just not sure why we would need application material for that. So just a sort of general comment to sort of, again, to avoid duplication across the standards when we've already got adequate requirements in place. And I think that goes to the comment that was already made also about the timing of the communications. And lastly, there's been a couple of people have mentioned 540 as somewhere to look as well. And I think there are some requirements in 540 that might be of a similar nature in terms of looking at what management has been doing when they're looking at judgments and accounting estimates and so on. I think some of that could also be applied in this context. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Eric. Fernando?
Thanks, Lynn and task force. A lot of good content in this section. Mixed views in terms of the options, but the majority supported having application material. We don't think that adding a requirement will really solve the issue, but really explaining how to do it, when to do it, and bringing up the concept of scalability will be more helpful for the different type of engagements that we have in other countries, not only the big ones. So we think it's going to be more helpful. And in terms of question number 5, nothing else to add. Thanks.
Thank you. Wendy?
Thank you, Tom. For question 4, strongly support changes to enhance two-way communication with those charged with governance, and overall support option 1. A little bit concerned about boilerplate and routine communications, and then also how to integrate the other standards so there's not duplication or confusion by auditors. The other concern or other item I wanted to point out is at appropriate times. That's in paragraph 64. I think application material to give examples of what those appropriate times might look like. And I strongly support that RM/ROM should be part of the communication to those charged with governance. I think that in particular item would help reduce the expectation gap based on some of those conversations that have taken place in the past. And then there was question or some clarification needed in paragraph 68. The proposal to develop a new requirement for the auditor to assess whether the remediation measures are appropriate would need some more context and guidance to be able to fulfill that obligation. And concerned also about when the timing of that might take place. And question 5, I think I've covered both. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's the last hand up in this section. Lynn, back to you.
Thank you very much. For headings for me, first of all, option 1 seems to be the preference for requirements. So I think that will be the way that we proceed. Secondly, there's quite a strong theme around management assessment and trying to build that into 240. The point was made, we can't set standards for others, which is true. So we're going to have to think very carefully about how we do that. But I do think it's a good idea that we get the responsibilities in the right places. The third thing I heard was around scalability, and that will be important as we work through this. And finally, there were some specifics. I liked the concept of stepping up the communication if there's potential fraud, and we'll build that into the section when we are talking about potential frauds. The authenticity of documents and evidence is something to think about, as is the regulation point. Noted a number of people talked about 540, and there was a general theme across people to be careful not of the interaction between the standards. And that was a point looping back to the first comment I made about option 1, for people as to where is the best place to talk about this and how do we have clarity in this area. I note that 260 doesn't talk about those charged with governance in terms of two-way communication, and I think that's the important thing we're talking about in terms of fraud, and has been a theme right through these discussions. So, Eric, in terms of your specifics, we will take them into account as we're thinking about them and get back to you with specific answers. So that was it, Tom, in terms of this section. Back to you.
Lynn, if you indulge me right now, I think it's a good time to have a 15-minute break right now. So we'll break for 15 minutes, allow people to stretch their legs. will return at 4:45 Eastern time here. I think it's been a really good discussion so far. And I saw even the slides were excited for the next bit of discussion on transparency. So I'm sure that'll be a robust discussion to follow. So 15-minute break. We'll be reconvening at 4:45. Okay, we're going to start in about a minute. Okay, could everyone be seated? Okay, let's begin again. Now we have the right slide on the screen. That's great. We're excited for a little more transparency. Lynn, it's back to you. We're all refreshed. We've had some caffeine, and we're ready to go.
Thank you very much, Tom, and welcome back, everybody. We're now moving on to our third topic, which is in the project proposal. We said that we needed to explore the need for more transparency in the auditor's report for fraud-related matters, but because there were strong mixed views, both from the consultation and the discussion paper. So since the December meeting, we have done further research on this topic, and the information is set out in the issues paper. Specifically, we went back to the previous projects, and mainly we looked at the auditor reporting, which was an obvious area. We also looked at what are the latest developments in other jurisdictions, particularly the Netherlands and the United Kingdom, and the supplement has some examples of their audit opinions at present. Given the mixed views, the task force intends to undertake targeted research to users of general purpose financial reports to obtain their opinions on the 4 specific alternatives that we have set out. And those alternatives are on the screen and in the paper. Alternative 1 is a detailed description of the fraud risks identified, the auditor's response, and the auditor's findings, all in the auditor's report. Alternative 2 is a high-level description of the fraud risks identified and how the auditor addressed the fraud risks. It's similar to the reporting in the Netherlands, so that those examples are in the supplement. Alternative 3 explains the extent to which the auditor is considered capable of identifying and assessing wrongs due to fraud, and is similar to the requirement in the UK. And finally, alternative 4 is mechanisms other than the auditor's report to enhance transparency. We accept that the options are not mutually exclusive, but for the purposes of consultation, we think it is good to set them out in this way. I've already talked about the supplement to agenda item 4, which are the auditors' reports from the United Kingdom and the Netherlands, and they are very up to date. Just to add a few comments on that, they are given to you to add a flavour of what 2 and 3 would look like. We have deliberately chosen a range of, in those examples, from the more basic to the more extensive in both lots of examples. And we do intend to use those examples in talking to users of financial statements. And I will come back to this, but we would really appreciate any contacts that you have for the users of financial statements, so we can make sure we get good input in this regard. So next slide, please. With that, we are interested in your views on these three questions. One, it might be useful on reflection if you start on number 7, because what we really need is to know that the 4 alternatives presented you think are appropriate to go out to our consultation for the users of financial statements, and also any other alternatives that should be presented in terms of option 4. So if we can have your opinions on that, then any other views on the alternatives, and any comments around the scope of it. Enhanced disclosures as set out in paragraph 110. So with that, Tom, back to you for input. This is still in the explore stage, so we're not trying to reduce alternatives. We're just trying to make sure they're robust enough for consultation. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. Anyone like to respond first, Sue?
Thanks. Lynn, I just had a question about option 4, actually, because it's described as being something other than the auditor's report, whereas in fact, the first bullet is talking about the existing requirements in relation to CAM and using that. So I would potentially see that as a kind of using a mechanism that is there within the audit report. So I'd just be caution about the kind of language there. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Kai Morton?
Thank you. It's a bit similar. I think alternative 4 talks about communication through CAMS. We have that mechanism. So is there a need to develop a new mechanism of communicating in the auditor's report? I think transparency is important here. So some way of requiring risk of material misstatements due to fraud to be treated as CAMS and involved, and then being reported in the auditor's report may be a better way of trying to develop a new mechanism of communicating. Thank you.
Kai-Uwe?
Thanks, Tom. I have a comment to question 6. We had a long discussion last Friday with my stakeholders, and after this discussion, I prefer option 4, which I believe can be applied to all entities, not just to listed entities or price. In my view, option 1 is a non-starter because it would cause all fraud risk identified in their assessment, as well as directions to assess risk and result to be set forth in the auditor's report, which is completely disproportionate for the auditor's report. Option 2, in my view, suffers from similar shortcomings, and option 3 is likely to lead to boilerplate. My comment to question 8 is while obtaining investor views and other users' views is important, the IAASB needs to be careful about how those views are weighted in the overall context of the project. investors and other users never suggest that they need less information as long as they are subject to the illusion that obtaining it is costless to them. There needs to be a balance between what management provides in the financial statements in relation to its treatment of the risk of fraud and what auditors provide in the auditor's report on the issue of fraud. I therefore suggest that this is an issue that also need to be addressed with accounting standard setters. These have been my 2 comments. Back to you, Tom. Thanks.
I just have to ask though, the question was, are you not suggesting that there should be a consultation on these options and that there should be more caution and thought?
That's fine for me. A consultation is fine. Thanks, Tom.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure. Sachiko.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you very much, Lynn, particularly because I think it's very, very important and also very challenge topic. So I really appreciate your tremendous work on this and also your team. First of all, at this time of moment, I also support Alternative 4 based on my outreach in Japan. That being said, I support Task Force's plan to conduct targeted outreach and presenting for alternatives. But I think the outreach should be maybe targeted at not only users, but also other participants in financial reporting ecosystem, such as management and those charged with governance, because as project proposer emphasized, collaboration with others in the financial reporting ecosystem is very important to address the issue of fraud. So I think, therefore, the targeted outreach should also cover such people to obtain balanced views on the transparency in reporting on fraud. And with regard to other comment on this topic, I think challenges for the auditor relating to Alternative 1 to 3 depends on whether and how much fraud-related information was disclosed by the entity in accordance with each jurisdiction disclosure requirement. Because for the auditor in the jurisdiction where the disclosure system requires the entity to disclose sufficiently detailed disclosure about fraud, I think the challenge for the auditor to disclose information in accordance with Alternative 1 to 3 may be relatively limited, because the auditor can disclose the auditor's approach to fraud by linking it to the entity's disclosure about the entity. But for the auditor in the jurisdiction where disclosure system does not require the entity to disclose fraud-related information, including management responsibility on fraud and fraud risk management, I think not only Alternatives 1 and 2, but also Alternative 3 may create challenge for the auditor because the auditor cannot disclose the auditor's approach by linking it to the entity's disclosure. So I think we need to take into account the reality that the challenge depends on level of disclosure provided by the entity, which varies depending on each jurisdiction disclosure requirement, to make sure that the revised standard can be applied across the globe. And on this point, I totally agree with Jania's comment on Tuesday that we need to be open-minded to narrow the expectation gap. But I also think this reality is something we need to also keep in mind when we conduct open-minded discussion to seek global solution. And I know it's a very, very difficult issue, but one possible way to address this issue is to research actual disclosure practices by the entities on fraud in several jurisdictions to consider appropriate way forward for the IAASB that balance different disclosure requirements by entity across the globe. But overall, I support the task force proposal to conduct outreach about alternatives with expansion on not only target user, but also other participants in the financial reporting ecosystem. And do I also need to comment on question 8, or is this addressed separately? So address separately or?
No, I think it's part of this
Okay.
section.
Okay. So on question 8, I think the scope of enhanced disclosure in the audit report should be applied only to an audit of financial statement, particular type of entity, such as public interest entity, where the auditor's report are used by a large number and wide range of stakeholders. So I agree to obtain stakeholders' view in the targeted outreach. That's all for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sachika. Wendy?
Thank you, Tom. I choose alternative 4 due to the need to do more reach out. And I think the respondents' views were very mixed. And so I couldn't get my arms around alternatives 1, 2, or 3, any of them being more effective than the others, had the same concerns about boilerplate or too much information that wouldn't be understandable. So I came to alternative 4, but strongly suggest the reach out that has been discussed, and maybe even looking at some existing information that might be available from FRC, where this has been out for some time, or forgetting the opinion for a minute, the PCAOB and their reach out to audit committees. So on the reach out list, I support preparers, those charged with governments, those charged with governance, and of course the users, which is a very broad group. And I think that answers all of those questions.
Thank you. Isabel?
Yes. On this project, I believe we have to keep in mind 3 important drivers. The first one is that we should avoid unnecessary expansion of the auditor's report. When I mean unnecessary expansion, is to provide more information and more lengthy development than what the users expect themselves. So that's why doing this outreach is key. Then the second driver is that we should not add a lot of boilerplate, because if we do so, we will not reach our goal. And the third driver is that I strongly believe that we will never reach a solution where one size will fit all. In some of the examples that were provided to us, they come from jurisdictions where the audit committee is preparing a public report in which they deal with topics such as fraud risk. So therefore, the auditor has something to build on in his own report. In some other countries, the audit committee are not preparing any public communication. And the financial statements often do not contain anything about the risk of fraud, and management report, management commentary not always contain something on the risk of fraud. So then the solution could be different jurisdiction from jurisdiction, depending on what is already the existing system of reporting from the audit committee or from management. So on that topic, I think my point is very similar to the one of Sachiko. My dear Sachiko, the French-Japanese team is back. And so we need to take into consideration what the audit committee is preparing. We need also to take into consideration what the responsibility of the audit committee is. In some entities, it's more structured, it's more clear that they have a responsibility on fraud. In some others, it's less clear. And we will have to deal with the topic in less complex entity. But when I mean that, it's not only the scope of our project on LCE, but also subsidiaries of group. When we have a statutory audit in subsidiaries of group, and is it expected that in each subsidiary of a group, when you have hundreds or thousands of statutory audit, each auditor develops some things on this topic? Is it relevant? Is it expected? And on what will the auditor be will be able to build. So really, we have to propose a solution that is flexible enough, because I believe that not one size will fit all. Having said that, as some other members have said their preference, not surprisingly, when we prepared in France, the outcome was also that initial view was that option 4 was the preferred one, but also we remain open-minded based on all these fundamental principles.
I guess I'm getting on some comments a little confused right now, because I understand some of the preferences being explained here, but I think the question at hand is, are these the appropriate options that the task force should go out to consult investors? So I don't know if it's implicit in the last comments whether we should be consulting on something else or not. I think I heard some trepidation and some flexibility, but Isabel, are you suggesting that there should be a different type of consultation with users as a result?
No, that was not my recommendation, but as some people have expressed the position of their stakeholder, I also wanted to share with you what was expressed in France.
Okay. Okay. And were you trying to plan?
Yeah, Tom, I'm very happy that we go between 6 and 7 with people sharing their views. It will get us to the right answer at the end, because as people discuss the alternatives and their views, it helps us crystallise how we consult and whether the 4 options are viable. So I'm happy with the way people are discussing it at present. It's consistent with previous discussions we've had.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that you were getting the feedback that you needed as a task force. So I don't want to preempt your views, but I wanted to make sure that you had got your feedback.
Thank you.
Yosh?
Thank you, Tom. As for improving the transparency of audit reporting on fraud, I think it is not necessarily required to improve transparency in all audit engagements. For example, it is necessary to consider the magnitude of the impact on the market by clients, like listed companies and PIEs. I believe that disclosing specific and informative information inherent to each audit would be consistent with the objective of this project. It might be difficult in practice, but for the listed companies whose intended users can understand complex information, I think that alternative 1 would meet this objective, but alternative 4, if using CAM, would meet also with this objective, I think. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Yosh. Bill?
Thanks, Tom.
Did we lose Bill? We'll come back to him. Edo?
Yes, thank you, Tom. Lynn, in respect of question 7, yeah, I think the 4 options together would represent the view. So I am personally, I had the same thinking as Kai Morten initially said. Is we have a mechanism that is the CAM, and is there a way that certain fraud risks, if not all, are automatically a CAM? And that would then bring a level of discussion in the auditor's report that's probably commensurate with option 2, I think. And we can also think of other mechanisms in there, such as a rebuttable presumption that a fraud risk is indeed a CAM. That allows for a little bit more flexibility. But that would be where I would go, and I would, if we're going to consult in it, I would appreciate if such an option would present itself as well. I recognize the struggles around the room or mentioned by some of the board members in light of management not having a requirement to report on fraud risks, which we don't have in the Netherlands, whereas the auditors are required to report. And what's happening as a result of it is that you are more inclined to go to more boilerplate language because there's nothing specific to point to, and you can't provide new information there. So it's something that the practice in the Netherlands is struggling with, but I do appreciate the desire to reach out and to investigate. And if I can help in any of that, happy to do so. In my thinking, where fraud risks and the way that they're being dealt with in the audit to rope them into the key audit matters would then, I think, also lead towards a direction that public interest entities and really explained to us earlier this week that the differential requirements particularly sit in the area of reporting and communication. That would be, so if we use that mechanism, that would then be a differential requirement. So for pi and up or whatever we make of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Eric?
The questions don't get any easier, do they? I really struggled with this section. You know, when I try to answer questions, I'm trying to think of like what are the criteria I need to use to get to the answer. How do I make a decision that's considering all the options? And I just found when the alternatives were just kind of thrown at me like that I just threw my hands up and didn't really know where to turn. I mean, I know all the work that we did when we extended the auditor's report a few years ago, all the outreach we did on that, and some of the sort of basic principles that we learned from all of that work. And I would hope that we could apply those in deciding what the reporting options should be. And I don't know whether these alternatives would meet those previous decisions that the board made. For example, one of the alternatives seems to suggest that the auditor would provide some kind of findings or conclusion, which with CAM reporting, we didn't do. So what am I saying? I'm saying I think we do need to consult, but I think we need to do that in the context of the knowledge that we've gained from our previous work on auditor reporting, so that the alternatives are not breaking our previous principles. I have some sympathy for option 4, but option 4 in itself was not, it was kind of an amalgam of 2 or 3 different options, it seemed to me. It wasn't really just one option. So that's sort of where I'm at the moment. Sorry, not very helpful.
Okay. John Lee.
Thank you. Very similar theme to what colleagues have shared. So I'll be brief. Supportive of going out to consult. The 4 options that's been laid out, to be honest, personally, I'm not a fan of 1 to 3 at all. I think as other colleagues have said, I think they suffer from different issues, including auditors needing to be the provider of original information, the tendency for the requirement to become boilerplate, and so on and so forth. So to be honest, just looking at it, I can't see them being plausible solutions, but maybe going out to consult users may give us surprising results. So not close to that. My only request is, for the 4th option, maybe to build it up a little bit, especially about using the existing mechanism of CAM to provide those information as a channel. So I think that we have gone through the really long process of, building up and issuing CAM as a solution, and it's been in the marketplace for a long time. So it'll be a good time now for us to reflect on that and see how that fraud angle can be built and potentially maybe what some of the things that Ado suggested could be considered. So going out to consult 1 to 3, okay, but 4 maybe to build it up a little bit. In terms of the audience, same as other colleagues, I think not just the users, but other stakeholders as well. And obviously UK FRC, Netherlands, NBA will be part of that. And if we need to reach out to stakeholders from our parts of the world, feel free to reach out. We'll be happy to support in connecting as well. In terms of the scope, as we heard yesterday, the PI project, one of the expected outcome is a guideline on when differential requirement might be appropriate. So I think great that Josephine is on your task force as well. So there will be interaction between the two task force / working group in coming to a recommendation there as well. So that will be my responses. Lynn, thanks.
Thank you, Chun-Wei. Sue?
Thank you. Lynn, I only came in on your first question previously, so just following through on the rest. I had a lot of the same comments as Ado did about CAM, so I won't repeat that, but I do feel that there is a mechanism there that could be used and potentially enhanced. The other attraction of that for me is the scalability point, because I think it is important that this kind of thing is scalable. And with the CAM sitting in that listed or PI type space, it does provide more capability for scalability potentially. Particularly since a lot of LCEs, there's relatively little change from one year to the next, and therefore you will naturally, I think, end up with something that is more boilerplate. The other point I had was around the outreach, and you've talked about the outreach in countries where the requirements have been in place for a while. And I think it would be really good there to be sort of incredibly targeted on some of the users, especially if we are thinking about the LCE impact. So thinking not just about audit committees or some of the larger investors that are in the public space, but retail banks, credit agencies, private equity, all those kind of things. And I would also then encourage really drilling into, if they've had this information for the last few years, have they really read it, and do they really understand it, and is it adding value? Because I think that will then inform our next stages. Thanks.
Thank you. Warren?
Thanks, Tom. Yes, I also have very similar views and also don't want to repeat. Maybe just with respects to the first one, of whether the alternatives presented are consistent, other alternatives. I mean, yes, I think the CAM option is a potentially viable one. And then just looking at the response profiles, where the pie chart is showing us that 28% disagreed with regards to whether there is a need for additional transparency, and I think the 22% said no comment at all. So I mean, being pessimistic is that 40% were unconvinced. Maybe then there still needs to be a sort of no, we do not think additional disclosure is required on the alternatives, just for the sake of completeness and to avoid the risk of it looking biased. Although having said that, I agree that this is something that definitely does require consultation. Just as a matter of interest, Lynn, there's actually some preliminary research that's being done on the UK report format. where the guys are trying to understand how users interpret that information. And with regard to the expectation gap, it actually looks like some stakeholders are interpreting that disclosure, even though it's quite clear, at least in my mind, that it's talking about whether the auditor has the capacity to identify fraud. Some people are actually interpreting that as meaning that the financial statements are free from fraud, and that the auditor is actually providing an opinion on fraud, which I personally don't quite get that. I think it's quite obvious, but I suppose for somebody that might not be an expert in this area, one must empathize and say, yes, it could lead to that sort of situation where people think the scope of the actual audit opinion is changing. While that work doesn't include the format employed in the Netherlands, I imagine the same results could potentially apply. So for that reason, I also found myself sitting in the option 4 bucket. And then with respects to the scope, I think it might be too soon to say, let's just look at pies or equivalents. Because, I mean, if we did decide to provide some type of disclosure on fraud reporting, I imagine that users in a non-PI environment could potentially get quite a lot of value out of whatever type of fraud-related disclosure gets provided. So maybe at this stage, keep that one fairly open as well, if you think it's pragmatic to do so.
Thank you, Warren. Bill?
Thanks, Tom. Look, I think I'm agreeing with what's gone before me, but I just want to preface it by saying, as a public member, I'm very conscious of the need for transparency. I also was interested in Janine's comments on day one, which said that perhaps we should revisit that the audit report is a place for disclosure where management should be the one disclosing. I have empathy with that, revisit that issue. But having said that, both of those points, and I've heard everyone else before me, and I sense there's and without me summing up on your behalf, Lynn or Tom, there's a clear viewpoint that options 1, 2, and 3, or alternatives 1, 2, and 3 aren't the best. That alternative 4 is the preferred option of the members of this board. And so I think that's a pretty clear steer in terms of any further outreach that ought to be taken. And so I'm supportive of that.
Okay. I'm not sure I agree entirely with that summary, Bill, other than only for the fact that I'm not sure that we were really asked to make an opinion on preferred options. Some have not. Some have expressed their view on option 4, and clearly there's some alternatives of option 4 that there was expressed a viewpoint on the need to consult and maybe the need to refine it. But I'm not sure that there was a clear path to the board, nor that we were asked to do that right now. So I just want to caution us to draw a conclusion. What I understood so far was even those who do have an express preference, for the most part, don't mind us consulting on these options. There was a lot of caution about maybe going down one path to the other for a number of reasons. Isabel described different reporting requirements in jurisdictions. Others suggested issues. Eric raised it. Is it consistent with the principles that we adopted when we improved our auditor reporting standard and others? So that's things I think people should be conscious of, or our task force should be conscious of. But I just want to be clear that for me, I would not express a preferred option today, because precisely what we're doing is trying to get the evidence to inform our preference. And what we didn't get enough of, as I read the task force paper, was user and other stakeholder input. We got a lot of input from practitioners and those highly connected to the standard setting process. And what I read was these were options that were given to us as part of our stakeholder outreach in the information gathering phase. And we wanted to do more exploration on these. And could this board provide us with some clarity about, are these the right ones to consult, whom we should consult, and how we should consult on, and maybe do we need to refine it? So I think there's support, from what I understand, for the consultation, generally support for roughly these options, even though there's some preference among some people and many people around the table towards an option 4 or something embedded in option 4, but too early for us to actually sort of lean into an option. I don't know if the task force members or Lynn want to come in now, but I think I've summarized what I thought I heard. I just, not that I disagree that some people expressed a preference to 4. I just worry that someone witnessing our conversation or for minutes sake would assume that we agreed on option 4 yet. Lynn, yes, what's up?
Tom, could I come back in? I think we're using individual views at present as a way to say these viable alternatives for us to put out to users. And I'm relatively comfortable because initial views from CAG were around options 2 and 3. Initially from the board, it's option 4. And it's showing that we still continue to have mixed views. And to me, it's reinforcing the importance of us consulting. Excuse me. And I'm pleased for the board's support for that. I heard one other thing that I found very useful, and that was the board setting out what they thought should be our drivers and the principles that we use to take us forward. And Eric, the light bulb went on for me when you said you were struggling and then went on to describe why. And I think that has been an incredibly useful part of this conversation, because what I heard as the board's drivers were, and this is from a variety of people, don't overload the audit report, don't encourage boilerplate disclosures, one size won't fit all, we may need differential reporting, keep it simple, be consistent with previous audit reporting work, and make sure things are useful and understandable. So I think we've got the beginnings there of an evaluation framework that we can use in order to eventually come to a way forward on this. And as we have said in putting together the project proposal, this is the most mixed views we've got on any item, and we are likely to talk about this at every board meeting where we discuss fraud over the next year. So this is a starting, it's not a finish, but I've found that the input we have received is a very good platform for us to take the next steps. Very happy though if any of the other task force members want to make any comments or add or correct anything I've said.
Does anyone want to come in? Diane?
Lynn, I think that's a really good summary, and I agree. I mean, it's the first discussion, right? We're going to discuss this for a long time. I think the other thing I heard that was quite helpful was the encouragement on the outreach and a broad outreach, right? So Sue mentioned some of the less complex entities, talking to PE houses. You know, when I was involved with the TCFD, we did a lot of outreach and understanding, you know, face-to-face discussions about how do you use the information we're going to be disclosing is very, very valuable. So I think we got some good tips, Lynn. I think we might be busy in terms of outreach, but I think that'll just help us all be more informed, and we'll have a broader view, both in terms of different stakeholders, but also just volume. You know, so I think that's all good stuff. So appreciate the comments, everybody.
Anyone else? Okay. People comfortable with Lynn's summing up? Okay, thank you. Lynn, back to you.
Thank you. And we are going to come back to users in the final slide. So just as a reminder, next topic is developing non-authoritative guidance. And next slide, please. In the project proposal, and you'll remember we had quite a substantive discussion on this at the December meeting, we agreed that we would put together some non-authoritative guidance about how 240 connects with the suite of ISAs. And what you have, and we also committed that this would be issued in the first half of 2022, this year, and it was part of our commitment to educate others. The task force is of the view that this diagram, together with succinct narrative, will describe the interaction between 240 and other ISAs, not all ISAs, just some key ISAs. And the diagram, as you see it on the screen in front of you, is intended to take the key topics in 240, which are in the blue circle, and they address the objectives of 240, and then going out through the fraud lenses, or in, depending on which way you want to see it, to the other ISAs. The narrative part focuses primarily on the interrelationship between 240 and the foundational standard 200. It has the identification of and assessment of risk of material misstatement due to fraud that we've talked a lot about today. It also has the response side of that as 240 on the right-hand side of the screen, and it explains the interdependencies with some of the other ISAs, providing examples of the linkages. The intention is that this goes through a Channel 3 process, which means it will go be updated with your comments now and then come to you for negative clearance. And we are hopeful to get it out in April. Next slide, please. So 2 questions here. Do you agree, first of all, with us going through Channel 3, as I had just described? And do you agree with the content and presentation and have any input for us in this regard? So with that, Tom, I turn it back to you.
Personally, very impressed with the graphics on this this non-authoritative guidance. Isabel.
Yes, thank you, and thanks for this non-authoritative guidance. So first of all, I agree with question 9, and that it's developed and clear through Channel 3 as contemplated in the framework. Regarding the document 4A, I believe we don't need a fraud lens, we need a magnifying glass. Because it's very difficult to read the graph and everything that is in it. And in fact, I searched and I had to magnify the document on my screen. I was searching something, I found finally below the graph in very little with a star reference, which was ISA 550. Because if I remember at the time the IAASB developed ISA 550, the only reason why it was revised and it was exposed and re-exposed and there have been lengthy discussion, it was because the IAASB wanted to better capture the fraud risk in related party transactions. And I went back to the basis for conclusion to ISA 550. And it's very clear that it's the number of fraud with related party transaction that was the reason for the expansion of this standard. So I acknowledge it's developed in the last part of the next page, but I would have expected to see more clearly on the graph and not only in the small reference below, reference to 550. Thank you.
Thank you. Wendy?
Thank you, Tom. Yes, for 9, I agree, it can be cleared through channel 3. And overall, I thought this was a great document, some good quick wins. And then the only question I have back to the task force is fraud lens. Is that defined anywhere? Could that be a confusing term? Could it imply some sort of forensics? So I didn't know if we needed to define it within the document. And that was my only comment.
Thank you. Kaioi?
Tom, thanks. My comment to question 9 is that I agree with the channel 3 process. However, I believe that the non-authoritative guidance is not really needed. If it is that important, it should be in the application material. And my comment to question 10 is I'm not convinced that engagement teams require this guidance and therefore ask whether it is needed at all. Tom, thanks. Back to you.
Thank you. Chun-Wei?
Thanks, Tom. So on 9, happy with the approach to be cleared through channel 3. I do have slightly similar question as Kaioi, and I didn't go back to check like who asked for it. So when we will ask whether this is useful, I thought it's probably best to ask those who needed this to confirm that this is what they need. I personally did not find it, I guess, exceptionally value adding. On 10, the only comment I have is the part on the fraud specific audit procedures. I'm not sure why we would leave out revenue recognition as a presumed fraud risk. I've always thought that that is one of the key defining features of 240 when the revision came out the last time. So that would be my comment on the document. But thanks, Task Force, for developing it and having it ready for us so quickly. Thanks.
Maybe just a point of clarification, maybe from the team. So I remember this was agreed as part of the project plan. So maybe some context of why this was added as part of the project plan.
Yeah, I can answer that. We had in our feedback, a strong request for the linkage between 240 and other standards. And that's why in the project proposal, we put this on the agenda to do up front. I don't think for technical people that understand this area and the interaction, this probably isn't for the audience like this board. It is for people who are either new or learning or don't quite understand. But there was a strong call through the consultation for this material. We have considered various options for how you could do it, including narrative comparing section by section. Our intention at present is to maybe think about that at the end of the project to show what's changed. But we thought in the short term, this was a quick and easy way to show people the interactions between them. So the board's previously agreed that we'll do this, and therefore implicitly that it is needed. I think the key point is that the audience is a more general audience than those with detailed technical knowledge. Sorry, that was a bit long, Tom.
Bev, you wanted to come in for a second?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think, so both in the roundtables as well as the responses to the discussion paper, there were lots of comments about the confusion of how 240 interacts with the other standards. And I think as we go into standard setting, and we've heard a little bit of that today, around what goes into ISO 240 and what goes into other standards and how they sort of all link up. So this was intended to be part of that education. So an integral part of this project is education around certain aspects of fraud. And this was agreed as part of that education that it would be done up front, and it would help people understand how the standard interacts as we move forward in progressing the changes.
Okay, helpful context, Lynn and Bev. Edo.
Yes, thank you, Tom. And thanks, Lynn and the working group for preparing this. I do think this is useful and responsive to what you set out in the project proposal, and also the basis for setting it out in the project proposal. So in that sense, I'm glad it's here and it's nearly ready to go. I'm happy to clear it through channel 3. I have 2 comments. The first one was very aligned with Isabel's. That's so maybe there's going to be a French-Dutch connection after all. So in respect of 550, and I would wonder whether you could add 550 in the top 2 boxes. But I'll leave that with you. And I had another question in respect of the objective of ISO 200. I had read 200 to be a little bit different in its objective. So maybe you want to have a look at that before it goes out. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Edo. Fernando.
Thanks, Tom, and also very much in favor of the document. I have to admit that I like a lot the title, the fraud lens, interactions, etc., etc. That really picks your attention, and I think it's a good way to engage people. I'm happy to work in translation and make it available as soon as it is approved using channel 3. Thanks.
Thank you. Eric?
Thanks. And I'm also very supportive of the development of this material. I think it is something where people have been struggling. And I recognize that the objective that we set out was to describe an integrated risk-based approach. And I think, my conclusion was that I don't think we've achieved that goal with this draft. What I found when we worked through the 540 implementation guidance, we had the same objective as to kind of show how 540 fits in with the risk model. And I think there was a very good publication produced to do that, which I think is much along the lines of this integrated risk approach. So I'm not sure if you looked at that, Lynn, but that was kind of more what I expected to see with this diagram. So it's just a suggestion to look at that approach.
Okay, Kai Morton.
Thank you. To start out with the question 9, support is to be developed through channel 3. And I think the content is also helpful for the users. I think the only caution is that when we do publish this, that it's being published and signaled that this is part of the updates coming in 240, as it's, as we said, the audience is different. If they see something coming out now, is there a risk that they think this is it? In a way, which it is not. So let's just be clear that there is more to come. So thanks.
Get this out, the task force could disband. We're done. We have a lot more board time on our agenda. You solved it for us, Kai. Sue.
Thank you. I'm also a yes on question 9. We have a few minor comments that I'll send through to you, Lynn. On question 10, it's probably similar to Wendy. I had a few bits of feedback during the outreach around the use of the term fraud lens, it being a new term and so on. We did try and look for an alternative, but I'm afraid, so being completely unhelpful, we didn't come up with anything else. But it's just a reflection that, some people were struggling a bit with it. Thanks.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify. So I hear general support for the release of the document. I think Eric suggested a look at a previous document. Maybe that provided hints. You've got some people providing feedback on it. I just wanted to make sure, Chun-Wei and Kai-Hui, that having heard the context, it's not a fatal issue for you to have something along the line sent out because it is consistent with the project plan.
Tom, yeah, so I appreciate the clarification. It was more from how useful this is. So I think Lynn mentioned this is not for technical people. And for us around the table, looking at it, you will wonder what is the value add. But, I guess for the layperson who are asking for that clarification, maybe this is what they need. So I guess my point was, to assess the usefulness, it has to be through that lens rather than from our perspective. I'm sorry for not making it clear just now. Thanks.
Thank you.
Tom, Tom, thanks very much. I very agree what Chun-Wei has mentioned. It's not a fatal flaw, and I agree with Chun-Wei. Thanks very much.
Thank you both. Lynn, back to you.
Thank you. 9 is a resounding yes, use channel 3. What I heard was general support for the document, but a few things to have a look at. Maybe elevating 550 and also including revenue, defining the fraud lens. We did that in this presentation very deliberately, and I think that probably is a sensible definition to include in this guidance. We will have another look at 200 to make sure that we're absolutely in accord there, and we will make it clear that this isn't the end of it. There is more to come. And Sally Ann assures me she has looked at 540, Eric. So we've taken into account various different ways people have done non-authoritative guidance. And I guess this is our take on it. So once again, really useful comments, and you can expect to see this back quite soon. Can I move on, Tom?
I just confirming, Sue, is your 10 still up? Okay, thank you. I think you can move on, Lynn.
Thank you. Next slide, please. We're now up to, so where are the next steps? I'm going to focus, we've just talked about the non-authoritative guidance in April, May, and we'll also be doing the outreach for the users of financial statements. At the June meeting, we will continue the discussion of 3 of the topics that we brought to the board today, as is required. So obviously it won't be the non-authoritative guidance, but the other 3 could come back depending on how much progress we make. In addition, we're going to provide you with our thinking on the introductory section. You'll remember that we agreed to look at the roles and responsibilities in the introduction. We're also going to consider definitions, the requirements on journal entries, specialised skills, we've touched on that today, and the presumption of fraud risk and revenue recognition. That session may include drafting on some of the topics depending on how far we get through. Then we have quite a 6-month break before we actually get to the final topics, which will come through in December, and working towards approval of the ED in June next year. Next slide, please. And this is just a final reminder. I know I've been very repetitive on this, but if you do have any contacts that would be useful for us to talk about in terms of in terms of users of financial statements, can you please provide them to Sally Ann, Hankin or Jasper, so we can progress that work very quickly. So that concludes our session on fraud from our perspective. I have found it extremely valuable to get your input and appreciate the positive way that you have both put your comments but also made suggestions. So on behalf of the task force and the staff, can I thank everybody very, very much for your input, and look forward to continuing this discussion in June. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Lynn. Thanks for chairing. Before we close the session, I hope, Lynn, you don't mind if I ask Jim Dowkin and Janine to share any observations on our discussion. Jim?
Thanks, Lynn. I thought the conversation was pretty reflective of what we discussed in the CAG, and clearly the messages on clarity and simplicity were important there. The one other reaction I'm going to have, which was not part of the CAG, but it's more of a personal reaction, and as on your page 13, I'm going to tell you something you already know, but you may want to talk to someone in the public sector, because fraud in the public sector is different inherently. They're not usually trying to bump up revenues. But that might be a good contact. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. Janine?
Yes, thanks, Tom. Yeah, we consider the fraud project as an important public interest project, of course, and that should contribute to narrowing the expectation gap. At the last board meeting, I indicated the importance of not only clarifying, but also strengthening the responsibilities, and as such, the audit work by the auditor in ISA 240 to further enable auditors to detect material misstatement due to fraud, to bring the detection risk down to an acceptably low level. And it's very encouraging to hear that the task force is aiming at driving different behaviors, and that you as board are thinking out of the box. At a previous meeting, I encouraged the board to also take into account the current audit approaches being more and more a non-control reliant audit approach, and to assess whether this has implications for the detection of ROM due to fraud on those audits compared to audits that use a control reliant audit approach, from the perspective of the audit risk model, which I like to reiterate today, as we consider understanding the impact of practice important in view of the aim to drive different behaviors in the end by this project. So yeah, and on the transparency, increased transparency through timely communications with those charged with governance, and reporting through the auditor's report by the auditor to provide early warning of suspected fraud, the risks of potential fraud, audit procedures performed to address those risks, the audit approach taken, and whether management has taken appropriate actions to address the fraud risks and related internal control deficiencies. We also consider important as PIOB. And obtaining input on the transparency options and level of transparency, particularly from investors and other users of financial statements, is key before the board's further deliberations on various options, I think. And that's also what you talked about. So the papers for today's discussions are encouraging, as well as the first discussions on the papers, although I like to express that what auditors eventually will need to disclose regarding fraud, including how and to what extent, may drive different auditor behaviors, including audit approaches, and could potentially contribute to enhanced transparency by companies' management in the financial statements and those charged with governance in their reporting. So I believe that for making a real impact that matters in addressing the expectation gap requires a lot of out-of-the-box thinking and innovative thinking, which I like to encourage you to continue doing as moving forward with the project. Thank you.
Thank you, Janine. Any other thoughts on fraud today? We'll definitely come back to this topic, as you could see. One of the benefits of us meeting simultaneously, benefits of us meeting simultaneously with IAASB is that we could do real-time consultation. And as you remember, yesterday, we left with an open issue related to the PI project. So we have done real-time consultation. Vili and Josephine could give you an update. I'm going to turn over to Vili for a second.
Thank you, Tom. I'll primarily give you the feedback because, as you know, Josephine is caught up in 2 task forces at the moment. So I ended up visiting the ethics board's meeting this morning to just give them an update on what transpired yesterday when we considered the PI project proposal, and to give them feedback on the consultation we had yesterday afternoon with the IAASB staff, and just to make sure that their board is comfortable in terms of the direction we are going to take, and which I will update you on now. So I did explain to the ethics board this morning that when we or in our project proposal, we contemplate revisions to the ISQMs and ISAs only, for the reasons that was set out in the issues paper as well. But then, as Isabel indicated yesterday, we identified the issue that in their glossary of terms, it is stated that in part 4A, the term audit applies equally to review. Which therefore means that when you read the requirement that was included in the code around public disclosure of the application of the independence requirements for public interest entities, that should also be read in the context of when performing a review of the financial statements of an entity. So what we discussed with the IAASB staff yesterday afternoon is that that is indeed correct. So the bottom line is that part 4A of the code applies to both audits and reviews. So that then brought in, we will have to look at our review standards. So as you know, we've got 2 review standards, ISRE 2410 and ISRE 2400. We will make very clear in our explanatory memorandum that there's no intention to open up ISRE 2410. The bottom line is, as you all know, that this standard has not been updated for any of the revisions to to any of the recently issued standards. And to open it up for anything now, we need to be very careful. We cannot create the appearance that this standard is up to date. We know that it requires a fulsome revision, and you will remember that we have included that in our work plan for 2022 to 2023 as one of the candidate topics. Obviously, which topic will emerge in the end will be a work plan decision based on the framework for activities. So that leaves ISRE 2400. In ISRE 2400, there is a requirement in paragraph 86 around the practitioner's review report that shall include a reference to the practitioner's obligation under the under that standard to comply with relevant ethical requirements. What we agreed is that or what Ken and his team shared with us, is that when the PI task force on the ethics side deliberated this matter, they were very much focused on disclosure in the auditor's report. And you might remember along the line, that was even the words they used. But in the end, they decided that, you know, it's about the remit of the two boards, and we need to give time for the IAASB to go through our due process. Ken also indicated at the ethics board meeting this morning that reviews were never explicitly considered. So what we suggest is that we will keep our project proposal as is, but when we go out with the exposure draft that we will bring to the board in June, we will explore in our explanatory memorandum in a similar way that we did initially with regard to the auditor's report. To ask whether in the case of review engagements, the practitioner's review report is a suitable location for such disclosure, and if so, whether stakeholders agree with how that may be accomplished. And I think on the slide we've indicated that on an initial review, there's possibly two ways of doing that. We can either put a conditional requirement into ISRE 2400 for when there's a review of a public interest entity. There's obviously also an open question of how many of those reviews are actually carried out, but I think that will come through in the consultation. Another possibility is that it could go into the other reporting responsibility section. But irrespective, we will explore that in the EM, because we still believe that the reason why we separated track 1 out was regarding the urgency around disclosure in the auditor's report. And that was the one that we were trying to align the effective date with the effective date of the ethics code, which is December 2024. So there is I did point that out specifically to the ethics board this morning. If we go down this approach based on the feedback we will get, we will then either decide to continue to pursue that, and we will put that as part of track 2, but then accepting obviously that anything that comes out of that, the effective date will not be aligned with the ethics code. And they were fairly comfortable with that. A few of their board members came in and said, I think this is this is a sensible approach, also taking account that they did not initially explicitly consider the reviews. So I just wanted to share that's the approach we're going to take. I don't know, Josephine, if there's anything else you wanted to add.
No, that's a fantastic summary. Thank you, Lily. The only thing is that that you said that we'll send the project proposal out as is, in case people are worried, as is with all the changes, obviously, we'll put through for you.
Yeah, it was specifically for this matter.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
This seems consistent with stop and work on lots of things right now.